Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. So here we are, top 10 RPGs and action adventures. I wasn't that sure I'm going to do this video, to be honest, but a lot of people requested that, so here we are. Up to this point I covered around 60, 70 or even 80, I don't even know how many obscure RPGs in my hidden gems or trash videos, but also in my other videos as well that you guys might have missed. So even though this top 10 list will include a lot of games from Hidden Gems or Trash series, I'm also going to include some games from other videos that you might have missed, from older videos and newer ones as well. Now, all of these games are in the video for a reason, and it's a top 10 for a reason, so I enjoyed playing all of these games. I gave it some thought, and this is the order in which I enjoyed all of these games from top 10 to number 1. So without further ado, let's begin. Hard to Be a God really surprised me when I first tried it out, because I expected some shitty, obscure RPG from 2007, but that wasn't the case. Especially when it comes to the story, which was really weird and very good, so here's what I had to say about this game. Hard to Be a God is an action RPG released in 2007.
You're a smart guy.
It's a very flawed but kinda interesting game. Some people would even say that it's a real hidden gem, but to be honest, I wouldn't go so far. However, the game has a couple of features that took me by surprise, and the more I played, the more interesting it got. So what's it all about? Well, I'm glad you asked.
What are you, a sissy?
Hard to Be a God has a medieval/sci-fi setting with a unique story. The story doesn't seem all that interesting at first, especially because it starts off really slow. Your character is a mercenary and you start the game in an Imperial intelligence camp. After you're introduced to some basic gameplay tips, you get a quest to kill a band of thieves who are terrorizing the merchants in the capital city. That's everything you get about the story in the beginning, and I thought it's going to be very generic and boring, but I was wrong. It opens up a lot more as you play, and if you're willing to pay attention to the dialogue, you could find this story very interesting.
Oh yeah? Then I lied. I like to lie, so get used to it.
The writing is surprisingly good, even though it has a bunch of typos and some plot holes here and there. And speaking about surprising features, it's fully voice acted. Even the quality of voice acting is not all that bad, it's good enough to take the story seriously.
Young man, are you always running headlong into whatever awaits you?
Well, maybe that's not the best way to describe it, because there is a lot of humor in the game. The dialogue can be very goofy at times.
I don't give a damn about that ugly bitch. Besides, she's a redhead.
Aren't all these noble chicks just the same as harbor area whores? The only difference is they use more makeup and stink of sweat a little less.
Yeah, anyway, let's talk about the gameplay. At first, I thought the gameplay is going to be very similar to Diablo-like action RPGs, probably because of the camera perspective. Well, it's not. It's a lot slower action gameplay, which controls like a third-person action RPG. Hard to Be a God has a very simplistic action gameplay with not a lot of depth. First of all, it's not a point-and-click game, you control the character with WASD and you use your mouse clicks for attacks. There are only a handful of skills you can learn when you level up, and you get to increase a couple of your stats. You can only use the skills with a corresponding weapon type, and all of your attacks use stamina as a resource. The stamina system is very similar to more modern games. The action itself is not all that great, but it's simple and it's functional. I played around 10 hours until I realized there is a block button in the game. Yeah, that would be very useful before. So it's not exactly a hack and slash game, you won't mow down a bunch of enemies at once. What really took me by surprise is the mounted combat. You can buy horses in this game, which makes traversing the map a lot more enjoyable, but certain horses allow you to use your weapons as well. The mounted combat is a lot easier compared to regular combat, it's not really balanced properly, but it's kinda fun. It reminds me of Sacred 2, although that game had a much superior gameplay in general. Hard to Be a God does a good job when it comes to customization, and it has a very interesting feature that I would like to see in modern RPGs. You have a couple of armor slots, but some items will change the role of your character, which means that certain NPCs will treat you differently. For example, in the early game, if you equip some thief armor pieces, you can talk with bandits and thieves and do a certain quest. But if you don't have those armor pieces on you, they will attack you on sight. It's a great idea, but it's really underdeveloped because you don't get to use the same feature later in the game. Speaking about armor pieces, you can equip different cloaks, and check this out, this game has cloak physics. I would say this is really impressive for a 2007 game on a budget. When it comes to the game world, you could say that this is an open world game. You'll have a bunch of smaller maps to explore which are connected with a loading screen. Besides the big city and some bigger locations, the exploration is pretty linear, with only 1 or 2 narrow paths. I would say the environment still holds up when it comes to the visuals. It's not the prettiest looking isometric RPG from 2007, but it's good enough. This game works pretty good on Steam, although you will need to tweak a couple of settings to make your experience the best it can be. It's just the resolution and some camera tweaks which will improve the camera angles a bit. I would recommend getting the game purely because of the story, but don't expect too much from the gameplay.
You're as dumb as a man can be, Your Majesty.
Legend Hand of God, or We Have Titan Quest at Home, is another ARPG that I actually played recently and made a dedicated video about it, but I'll give you the shorter version in this video. This game came out in late 2007, only on PC, and it's been delisted on Steam. It's abandonware, but you can easily find it and download it with a simple Google search. The only technical issue that you might have is the old version of NVIDIA PhysX driver that you'll have to install. I'll leave the link for that in the description. Other than that, I was able to run the game in 4K with no major issues. Even the UI scales perfectly to high resolutions, which is usually not the case with such older games. There are some frame drops here and there, but for the most part the game runs smoothly. Actually, I had a minor issue with the text font in the game. It looks like there is no space between the words, which makes it awkward and a bit harder to read.
That's not a good sign.
Maybe this is because of the high resolution, I'm not sure, but it didn't bother me a lot. As you can probably tell, Legend Hand of God has aged very well when it comes to the visuals. We can easily compare this ARPG with other similar games from this time period, like Titan Quest for example. You can even argue that this game looks better, although Titan Quest has a more stylized look and a much higher budget by the way. So it's definitely impressive how a smaller studio from Germany managed to develop a great looking isometric ARPG in 2007.
I believe you.
The way the game does lighting is also interesting because your mouse cursor is actually a light elf called Luna. Luna will light up darker areas, talk with you,
I think we're in the wrong place.
give you tips and so on. She's essentially your companion. Cosma Shiva Hagen is the German-American actress who voiced the light elf by the way. She was also featured in box art promotions for the game, so there's that. You'll spend a lot of time in the beginning exploring forest areas and some dark dungeons, but then you'll move on to desert-like areas as well as the snowy mountains. The vegetation in this game is quick to show you those sweet PhysX driver effects. The grass never stops moving, so I guess it's always windy in the game or something. And of course, the vegetation interacts with NPCs and the player in a very satisfying way. So what's this game all about, C4G? Well, I'm glad you asked. Nerd. You play as a hero called Targan, who is about to be accepted as an adept into the Order of the Holy Flame. During the night before his initiation, the Eternal Flame goes out and the lands of Aris is once again haunted by demons. All NPCs and the dialogue is fully voice acted, which is quite impressive actually.
My wife and child suddenly fell ill when the dead rose from their graves. People say it's because of the curse of the Lich, but I know the true reason.
Again, we're talking about an RPG from 2007 by a small studio, so yeah, I find that quite impressive.
Is that so? Well then, you have my credit.
No.
Luna has a very annoying voice. Although the pitch of her voice makes sense because she's a little elf, but that doesn't make it more enjoyable to listen.
The east path leads to Turint, and the northern moor lies to the north. Okay, so where else would you find the northern moor?
To be honest, no.
Legend Hand of God had an interesting marketing pitch for the gameplay. They described it as cinematic combat system that enables realistic 3D fights. Okay, come to think of it, many action adventures from this time period used similar verbiage to describe the gameplay mechanics. Anyway, this game functions very similar to most action RPGs of its kind. You use your mouse to move and attack enemies, and you can rotate the camera with WASD. Legend Hand of God doesn't have the most responsive control scheme, but moving around and attacking feels okay. It starts to feel a bit janky when you try to do some actions a bit faster. For example, I use this jumping attack quite a bit, and I would have to move away from the enemy in order to use it. But moving away from the fight can feel extremely janky, especially if the enemy is in the middle of the attack that's going to hit you. On the other side, I could use this ability up to 5 times in a row sometimes, which felt pretty good. There seems to be some parts of the game which block your actions and the field of view of the enemy, even though they don't look like it.
I can't do that.
The melee combat is very static as well, which makes most fights feel like a stat check. I mean, it's not like most ARPGs from back in the day had skill-based abilities where you had to dodge or move out of the way, but still. Every bigger enemy and bosses are pretty much the same, it's not that fun to fight them. That being said, killing regular enemies feels satisfying, which is one of the most important things to get right. If you pay attention to animations, you'll notice how enemies react properly to getting hit. Their body will usually bounce in the direction of the hit, and this also applies to the player. I guess this is one of the reasons why they call this a cinematic combat system, I don't know. It looks pretty cool though, and I can't think of another old ARPG that tried to do something similar. When you get in fights against bigger enemies like giants and many different reskins of the same enemy, your character completely changes his attack animations. Yeah, this took me by surprise when it first happened because I never saw anything similar. You get totally different animations, which seem a bit more appropriate for fighting bigger enemies like this. Then again, you'll get to fight some other big enemies in the game and your animations won't change like this, you'll use default attack animations. The first time it happened it seemed cool, but it quickly gets annoying because your attacks are much slower. Combined with the hit chance, which was pretty low on my character because I forgot to invest points into dexterity, it makes these fights a drag. Although the second part of that wasn't the game's fault, I just dumped my points into strength and constitution. I actually almost ruined my melee build because of this, but I started investing more points into dexterity as I leveled up. You equip items by dragging them from the bags to your character model, and you can also unequip items like this. Even though it can be a bit annoying, I like this quirky feature and it reminds me of Morrowind a little bit. The hit chance I mentioned before also reminds me of Morrowind, and not in a fun way. Look, there is certainly a place for hit chances in RPGs, but having them in these types of games feels redundant. Especially when your control scheme is not that responsive, it only makes the action feel worse. Right off the bat, you get to choose 2 specializations for a character. This means that you have 2 different skill trees, basically. When you level up, you get points for both of these talent trees, and you can choose between some passive and active abilities. The itemization system is heavily based around your specialization choice. Overall, I had fun while playing this game, and I might even do a second playthrough in the future.
What a brilliant idea!
I would highly recommend checking it out if you can bother with installing abandonware games on your PC. Blades of Time was one of the first games that I ever covered in this series, and I was really surprised how good that game actually is. It's the first action adventure on this list, and here's what I had to say about it. Blades of Time is a hack-and-slash action adventure released in 2012 for PC, PS3 and Xbox 360. It was also released on Nintendo Switch a few years ago, but unfortunately, that port seems to have a lot of problems. However, the PC version is almost flawless. I managed to play it on 4K with the highest details, and the frame rate was pretty much locked on 120. Blades of Time is definitely an underrated game, if you ask me. First of all, it looks pretty damn good, despite the low resolution textures on many of the world assets. But the main reason for looking this good is obviously hair physics. Yeah, anyway, even though Blades of Time has a pretty weak story and very generic main character, it's worth playing this game for the gameplay itself. You play as a treasure hunter called Ayumi, who ends up on this magical island. Your main goal is to reunite with your partner, but in the meantime you discover the true magic of this island and you gain magical powers. Some characters are kinda interesting, but the story is really not that great. So let's talk about the gameplay. Blades of Time has a unique time rewinding mechanic that might seem like just a gimmick at first, but it turns out to be much more than that. When I first learned about this, I assumed it's just a mechanic that you use when you make a mistake, like in Prince of Persia for example, but it's actually a lot different than that. Rewinding time in this game allows you to see what happened in the past 15 seconds or so, but this mechanic also creates a copy of yourself. So for example, if you're in the middle of the fight, if you rewind the time for just a couple of seconds, it allows you to attack the enemy with your clone and essentially change the past. It's a lot simpler than it sounds. A lot of enemies will require you to use this mechanic because that will be the only way to kill them. Even the bosses utilize this mechanic in a very interesting way. For example, this enemy has a special shield which can only be broken with a very fast gunfire. So you have to shoot it a couple of times and rewind the time so you can shoot it with your clone at the same time. You can rewind the time a couple of times in a row and create multiple copies of yourself. But of course, this wouldn't matter a lot if the action gameplay was not good in general. Blades of Time has a fast-paced action combat that relies on different combos and spells. As you progress through the game, you will unlock more attacks and spells, which you can execute with different button combinations. These spells feel really impactful, which gives the combat a decent amount of weight. The flow of the combat is just amazing, and the game feels pretty balanced. You absolutely need to learn how to take the advantage of your combos and spells. Otherwise, the enemies can easily kill you in just a couple of hits. The character progression as well as the story is pretty linear. You don't have a lot of wiggle room while exploring these maps, but there are secrets to find by using your compass. Other than that, the level design is quite linear, but you'll need to use the same time mechanic to solve puzzles and do some platforming. The puzzles are okay, but the platforming is not exactly amazing. Even though the controls are pretty snappy in this game, controlling a Yumi can feel a bit floaty and janky sometimes. That's not so good when the game requires precision while double jumping and dashing. To sum it up, I highly recommend playing this game because it's definitely a hidden gem. I might do a dedicated video about Blades of Time just because I like it a lot.
Depths of Peril is only one of the games that I covered in a separate video about all of the games from this particular studio. This RPG was one of the prime examples why you shouldn't judge the book by its covers.
Depths of Peril came out in 2007 and it was the first game from this humble little studio. This game is described as a single-player RPG with strong strategy elements. Naturally, I was really skeptical about that before I started playing and I didn't expect much from this game in general. But I was wrong. Depths of Peril is one of the most enjoyable ARPGs that I played in recent memory. Simply because the game truly lives up to that description, especially the strategy parts. Looks can be deceiving, and that's certainly the case with Depths of Peril. In fact, that's pretty much the case with all Soldak Entertainment RPGs, which is a shame. I can see why people would take one glance at this game and not even consider playing it. The animations seem very simplistic and primitive, and the gameplay looks extremely janky because of this. You would not be wrong to assume this, because that's exactly what this game is, although I'm going to try and explain why that doesn't matter a lot. I mean, sure, the fidelity is pretty low, but artistic style is not bad at all if you ask me. I was able to run it in 4K, and surprisingly, the game scales fine on such high resolutions. Although you have to set up your desktop resolution to at least Full HD before you try and change the game's resolution. Otherwise, you can have some visual issues when you start the game. I really like how Soldak Entertainment uses the color in this game. The color palette is very vibrant, which creates a nice and cozy atmosphere in the game. Exploring different maps is very pleasant because of this, and all areas have a distinct vibe and feel to them. Not only when it comes to open areas, even the dungeons have a really cool look. But you won't play this game because of how it looks, let's be honest. Depths of Peril has a very unique gameplay formula which mixes ARPG features with strategy and even MOBA elements, I would say.
You start the game by choosing your character class and creating a new world. Some of these options were confusing the first time I played, and I made some crucial mistakes. You can set up the level of Covenant's power, the aggression, and the world difficulty. The Covenant power setting is what I got completely wrong because I selected 95. I totally underestimated the difficulty, and I quickly learned that the hard way. What this actually means is that NPCs from enemy Covenant will start on this level, which puts you in a huge disadvantage. So you should try to keep this setting close to normal or high. When you start the game, you spawn in your house. All Covenants in the game have their own house in the village. You can control the number of Covenants from those settings we just talked about, and there seems to be a very decent amount of them. Each time you start the game, you'll get a different mix of Covenants with unique status effects, which can change their behavior in a way. Ultimately, the main goal of this game is to gain the control of the village and become one and only leader. You can win the game in a couple of different ways, but the most obvious one is to defeat other Covenants in power ranking. You'll gain influence and power as you do quests and recruit NPCs in your Covenant. Strategy features have a very decent amount of depth. You can make diplomacy deals, trade, or even adventure together with other Covenants. It's really damn cool. It's not that hard to understand the strategy elements once you start playing the game. It's far from being complicated, even though it might seem like that at first. The thing is, I didn't learn anything from my first playthrough because I was playing as a total jerk. Every time when some powerful Covenant demanded something, I just told them to f*** off. That was pretty much a f*** around and find out situation. I failed to realize that the game will end if your lifestone gets destroyed. That's one of those MOBA elements that I mentioned, and it works surprisingly very good in this game. Same goes for other Covenants. If you manage to destroy the lifestone in their house, well, they lose, to say the least. The game gives you many different ways to get to that point, either through sheer power of your Covenant, diplomacy, and your general relationship with other Covenants. You can try to raid Covenants with another friendly Covenant or alone, or start a rumor which will negatively affect their influence. Speaking of which, one of your main goals is to gain influence and crystals. With enough influence, you can get better deals with Covenants, and with enough crystals, you can recruit powerful guards for your house. And you can also find NPCs in the open world or doing quests in the village. I can't stress enough how alive this world feels, because there is so much going on in the village and the open world as well. These systems would put many modern ARPGs to shame. Not to mention that this is a very unique mix of genres, and we all know that AAA studios will not even dare to try something similar, especially today. They would rather play it very safe, but we still have many aspiring indie developers that are willing to experiment. I really had troubles to wrap my head around this, because if we compare these gameplay features to most modern ARPGs, Depths of Peril will totally blow them away. Quests are very dynamic and the AI is very smart. There is only a certain amount of quests that you can take at once, and you can also fail quests. Other Covenants will try to do the same thing as you. You'll find them in the open world fighting monsters and trying to recruit NPCs. Monsters can organize packs and become much stronger. There are some events in the village that will happen occasionally, and there is so much going on between the Covenants in general. You can keep up with those activities by just looking at the history tab. You'll constantly receive offers from Covenants, and the way they talk to you depends on your current relationship status. So what about the RPG side of things and the action gameplay? Well, the action itself is very underwhelming because of the extremely janky nature of this gameplay. It takes a while to get used to, but even this aspect of the gameplay was very enjoyable for me. The itemization is done very good in this game, the open world is fun to explore, and killing things becomes more enjoyable when you gain some levels. The character progression is not that deep like the strategy elements of the game, but it's good enough to make a decent build. I played as a warrior and I focused on two-handed weapons. Getting a powerful item will immediately affect your gameplay, so there is certainly a nice sense of progression. You get to take one follower with you, and they also level up. You can give them items or send them to defend your house. The zones that you can explore have enemies with different levels, and the difficulty really picks up around level 10.
Speaking of character levels, if you lose the game, you don't lose your character unless you play in hardcore. This means that you can create a new world, select the level of the Covenant again and use the same character. You get to keep all of your items and the progression, you only reset the open world and all the Covenants. The first time I died, I got roasted by the game so hard. You're dead, really dead this time, loser. You've lost the chance to rule Jorvik. Despite your pathetic skills, we may still survive this war. Can you do better? I love this fucking developer. Speaking of how the dialogue works in this game, you'll find some hilarious responses for the Covenants, especially if you're on bad terms with them. How do you like this? We still won't like you. I found it really interesting how you need to balance out the open world exploration and quests, along with managing your Covenant and everything that happens in Jorvik. I did have some issues with the gameplay though, mostly on the fundamental level. The janky gameplay didn't bother me that much because the speed of the gameplay is on the slower side, so you don't need to have any twitchy reactions. However, I did find it really annoying sometimes when you have to click on something specific. When you have a big fight between the Covenants, it's almost impossible to click on a specific enemy. To make things even worse, the path is blocked message will be on the screen more often than not. The pathing issues are a pretty big problem in this game, and you can usually only interact with NPCs that are very close to you. I praised the dungeons before, but some of them have a very annoying design, with bunch of narrow areas where we just hit the dead end. Besides that, I really don't have any major critiques. Depths of Peril has an insane replay value, which is also worth mentioning. I'll happily come back to this game and do another playthrough. The best thing about it, you have total control when it comes to the general length of the playthrough by just messing around with the settings. And I love that you just continue to improve your character no matter if you win or lose. I'm a huge fan of consistent progression in ARPGs, so this is music to my ears. You can always try out another class though, which I plan to do in my free time. I highly recommend checking out this hidden gem of an RPG. I would really like to see a remaster of this game with better graphics and animations while keeping the gameplay system intact. One can hope, right? Nax is a very old ARPG, which I covered in one of my most famous videos on the channel actually. Nax is an action RPG that came out almost 22 years ago. This game came out just a couple of months before Diablo 2, and I think that's one of the reasons why it got overlooked and kinda forgotten, unfortunately. At the first glance, Nax might seem like just another hack and slash isometric RPG from early 2000s, but it's so much more than that. The story is kinda goofy and really simple, but interesting enough to keep you invested in the campaign. Jack is the name of the main character, but you can name him however you want and customize him a bit. By the way, everything about this menu just screams late 90s gaming. The visuals and the sound effects as well. I love it. Anyway, Jack just wanted to watch the TV in peace and get some dinner, but he gets pulled into this fantasy world of Nax. Like I said, it's kinda goofy, but it's definitely fun. You get to choose between 3 different character types, and this is the most important decision you will make in the game. The thing is, the game has 3 different campaigns, and each of these 3 characters has a unique progression path. But we're here to talk about the magic gameplay in particular, and that's where the wizard class comes into play. The way this character works is pretty simple. The game gives you new spells as you progress further in the campaign. But it also gives you a lot of freedom with combining the spells however you see fit. Nax has an amazing sense of progression because it feels really balanced, although the game is really light on RPG elements. It's definitely focused more on action, and that's precisely why the gameplay feels really good. As a wizard, you need to aim most of your spells and kite enemies, because your character is pretty squishy. The controls are responsive and snappy, which is really important because the gameplay in Nax relies a lot on players' muscle memory. Nax is not completely deprived of RPG elements. You will find some stronger gear as you progress, although that aspect of the game is not that important compared to something like Diablo 2. That's because the game is really focused on your mechanical skills rather than your gear. Nax doesn't have randomly generated maps, it's a lot more linear experience. But it has a lot of secrets that you can discover along the way, as well as interesting puzzles. The maps are designed around these 3 different character types, so your spells are not only used in combat, but solving puzzles as well. There are a decent amount of puzzles that you have to solve during the campaign, and the game teaches you this quite early. The game doesn't hold your hand though, and you have to figure things out by yourself, which was a common thing in games from that period. There is a multiplayer mode as well, and according to a lot of people who played it, it's amazing and really skill based. That's not so hard to believe because, like I said, even the campaign requires you to have some decent mechanical skills. I never got the chance to try out the multiplayer myself, but I had to mention it. I highly suggest playing as a wizard if you decide to revisit this old classic on the PC. I got it on GOG and I had to run it in Windows 98 compatibility mode because that's the only way the game will work on Windows 10.
7 is a really underrated ARPG, and I think I gave it a #1 spot in one of my Hidden Gems of Trash videos.
7 The Days Long Gone is a unique action RPG from 2017. I can tell you straight away that this is a very underrated RPG and a real hidden gem. I'm a huge fan of isometric action RPGs and I played a lot of them, but I never experienced a game like 7 before. Is it a perfect game with no issues? Of course not, and I have more than a couple of things I want to complain about, surprise surprise. 7 is set in a distant cyberpunk future. I'm personally not a huge fan of cyberpunk settings in games, but I quickly fell in love with this game regardless. Not exactly because of the story and the setting, even though I think the story is pretty decent. The dialogue is well written and the voice acting is good.
Please tell me someone pointed you to me because you know where Mayor Hucknall is.
I don't. Is he missing or something?
Sheriff Whitaker's the name. I'm the law in this town. Our cowardly mayor's gone too far this time.
The cutscenes try to depict this world as very dark and grim, while the game itself is not exactly following that philosophy. There is definitely a slight disparity between the cutscenes and the game itself, but overall I think the story is decent and you have a couple of ways to finish the game. The lack of memorable characters might be my biggest problem with the story. When it comes to graphics, 7 looks absolutely amazing, especially in 4K. Unfortunately, I had to drop my resolution on PC to Full HD because I just couldn't get steady 60 FPS on 4K. This is not exactly the game's fault, my PC is pretty average for today's standards and I can usually only run older games in 4K resolution. The game works great on max settings and Full HD on this PC, so take that as a frame of reference if you want to get the game on PC. If not, you can also get it on current gen consoles as well, and I might pick it up on my PS5 just because of that 4K resolution. The visuals in this game remind me of Borderlands, in a way, probably because of the cel-shaded cartoony art style. I was blown away more than a couple of times with the impressive distant terrain and the insane verticality of this open world map, but we'll get to that soon. You play as Peril, a master thief who ends up on an isolated prison island called Peril. Peril got possessed by a demon and he will be your guide for the whole game. They usually have a fun back and forth dialogue.
Of course not. Why do you assume we are to blame for all the ill in the world?
I don't know. Perhaps it's the fact that you possessed me and brought me to this shithole.
The island of Peril has a couple of big rules. You have to acquire different visas in order to explore major populated areas without being attacked by the guards. You'll mostly explore this open world by foot, but there is a fast travel system which needs to be unlocked at specific points of the map. The exploration is stellar in this game. The open world in 7 has phenomenal verticality, which wouldn't be that impressive on its own. What makes it amazing is the great parkour system, which allows you to seamlessly climb and jump all around the map. It's almost like you're playing an isometric Assassin's Creed game. This also means that most of your deaths will probably be because of the physics, because you will make wrong steps. However, I think 7 controls pretty good when it comes to exploration. The combat on the other hand is not amazing in terms of controls. It's not bad, but I never feel like I'm in a total control of my character's movement. That's because every attack is moving your character forwards, and I almost never like when games are doing this. The combat itself is pretty decent. There is no leveling in this game. Instead, you'll be able to find different ships with modules, which allows you to acquire new passive and active abilities. Peril is a master thief, so the game gives you a lot of stealth gadgets, but you don't have to focus on this playstyle. You can go in guns blazing or swords blazing, although there will be a lot of situations where that approach is a lot harder. Stealth approach is definitely more desirable in general. Like I said, there are no levels, but it's easy to tell what enemy is tougher than others by using this scan ability.
And of course, by using common sense, I mean if you see an NPC in a badass armor, he's probably tough. The equipment plays a big role in this game, although I think they kinda dropped the ball with armors and weapons. There is a nice crafting system that you should use, but it's not good enough to justify the poor quantity of weapons and armors. Speaking of armors, right from the beginning I killed one of the guards and took his armor, but when you get close to other guards, they will attack you after a couple of seconds. I thought that's pretty cool. I think this game would be 10 times better if it had traditional action RPG looting system with items of different quality. But on the other hand, it will probably make the stealth a bit worse or a lot easier. It's really fun to sneak around and steal stuff, assassinate or knock down enemies, and even all the minigames are pretty good. I know I had a lot of praise for the open world and its verticality, but sometimes this is exactly what can make the gameplay more annoying than it should be. The transparency of objects can be very confusing, especially when you're in a building with multiple floors, which happens more than often in this game. It can get in the way a lot, and I find it extremely disorienting sometimes. I also don't like the fact that the camera is moving with your character. I would always prefer a static camera in this perspective, but all of those problems were not enough to ruin my experience with this game.
If you have any more obvious advice, please keep it to yourself.
If you're a fan of open worlds, isometric RPGs, cyberpunk settings or stealth action gameplay, you should definitely check this game out. I think it's a real hidden gem.
Knight's Contract was a very weird action adventure which had a lot of problems, but it was very memorable, so I decided to include it here. Knight's Contract is an action hack and slash game released in 2011 for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. I always thought this game looks pretty cool, but I never got the chance to try it out before. You can easily emulate this game with PS3 emulator nowadays, although the frame rate is stuck on 30 FPS. I used the upscaling option within the emulator to achieve 4K resolution, if you're wondering. This game received some pretty mediocre ratings when it came out, and after playing it myself, I can definitely see why. I think this game is my personal worst case of love-hate relationship that I ever experienced.
So, you've actually come.
Enough, I'm not here for sex.
There is a lot to love about this game, and you can even say it's very underrated in some regards. On the other side, it has a couple of very bad, or you can even say game-breaking mechanics. But let's talk about the positive stuff first.
It looks like talking isn't going to get us anywhere, is it?
I think this game looks very good in general, even today, especially if you can run it on 4K on your PC. The graphical fidelity is not exactly amazing, obviously, and you can find a lot of low-res textures here and there. But there are also a lot of cool visual details, like the snow effect on this level, or the whole lava theme on this particular level. There are also some very creative enemy designs, especially for bosses.
I could never forget you! I'll tear you apart, along with that traitorous witch! Ha! Is that so? You were far more violent than I was.
When it comes to combat, you can see some cool dismemberment effects, as well as some brutal looking finishing moves that you can pull off. Oh yeah, and some straight up bizarre visual effects, which I have to blur out, but still kinda cool.
What?
When it comes to the gameplay, Knight's Contract has a very decent action combat system with a good amount of challenge. You have a combo system with 2 different attack buttons that you can combine, a dodge mechanic and different spells to use, which are provided by a witch follower. The gameplay can be described as a clunkier version of Darksiders 2, in a way. The controls are not exactly the snappiest, but they are not sluggish either. And if we could leave it at that, it would be an amazing game, right? Well, we have to talk about the bad stuff as well, and let's start with the worst one. I got 3 letters for you. QTE. Yeah, my arch enemy is back to torment me once again in one of these videos. If you're watching this series, you know I already covered several games which have some terrible QTE segments. Knight's Contract is hands down the worst when it comes to this, because QTEs in this game are unapologetic. Sometimes they don't even make any sense, because I'm literally pressing the right button at the right time and somehow I still fail. My girlfriend seems to have more luck with QTEs, so she killed one of the bosses for me, by pure luck of course. I mean, we all know that women don't know how to play.
Do you wanna be single?
Anyway, to make things worse, the boss will heal up if you fail the segment, so you have to bring his health down again before you get another try with the QTE.
I can't even stress enough how bad it feels in this game, up to the point where I won't even recommend trying this game out. Like I said, the game has a decent amount of challenging fights, which only makes failing QTE segments even worse. Which brings us to another very bad mechanic, but we have to mention the story first, in order for this to make any sense.
The Black Death. Just what I need.
Knight's Contract has a pretty unique setting. It's a fantasy medieval Germany setting with a fairly interesting story for an action game. You play as a knight called Henrik, who is cursed with immortality by a witch called Gretchen. Gretchen was slain by Henrik, and coincidentally, Gretchen becomes his companion after a century has passed from those events. Henrik actually killed the rest of the powerful witches, but they are back as hideous monsters. These witches are the main bosses in the game, and like I said before, they have a pretty unique visual design. I enjoy these fights quite a bit, if we exclude the awful QTEs and the second worst mechanic in the game related to Gretchen. You have to babysit her throughout the entire game, and not only that, but you have to pick her up quite often.
What?
Yeah, you literally pick up girls in this game. Well, a girl, but still. That probably sounds like a great mechanic, right? Well, no, because instead of thinking about your own health and the enemy you're fighting, you'll constantly have to worry about her getting killed like an idiot. Heinrich is immortal, so even when you die, you have to press X until your thumb bleeds before you resurrect again, and by the time you do it, Gretchen is usually very much dead.
How is that possible?
Picking her up will slowly regenerate her health, which is very cute. That was sarcasm, by the way.
Enough.
The spells you can cast in combat are actually coming from Gretchen. You can cast these spells even when Heinrich is down, although that's not very helpful. These spells are essential for killing even the most basic enemies. When you get their health down a little bit, you'll be able to execute most of them with a spell, plus another less tedious QTE you have to do. I think her spells are very cool and impactful, but sometimes the game can look like a pixel soup. The effects are a little bit over the top, which can make it hard to see what the f is going on. The camera can make things even worse, especially when the game insists on using a static camera angle in some random segments. It also doesn't help that you have to keep holding the lock-on button in most situations, and at the same time press 2 buttons for casting a spell. This feels harder than it should be, because you're essentially pressing 3 buttons at once every time you want to cast a spell. Even though the game is pretty linear, you can still somehow get lost and go in circles on these levels, which can be very annoying. The level design is not the best, especially in those moments, but it's only a minor issue compared to what I just talked about. The action combat can be extremely enjoyable when you get the hang of it. I'm really pissed off because this could easily be an amazing action game if not for those issues. Sadly, I can't recommend playing this game today, because most people will probably get really mad and rage quit, and I don't blame them.
Don't be a fool.
Besides the very stupid name, Shadows Awakening is actually a very underrated ARPG with some very cool features. Shadows Awakening is an isometric action RPG that came out in 2018. After playing this game for a while, I can say without a doubt that it's one of the most underrated isometric action RPGs that I ever played. I never heard about this game before until people suggested it in my previous videos. First of all, what the fuck is this name, man? It's very stupid and kinda generic. Putting that aside, Shadows Awakening has some very unique features which really caught me by surprise. This is actually a party-based action RPG. Well, kinda. You usually get to control one character in Diablo-like action RPGs, but Shadows Awakening allows you to have up to 4 characters in your party. As you progress through the game, you unlock more characters and you can choose how to build your party. Some of these characters will be locked on your playthrough, so if you want to experience everything, you'll need to do multiple playthroughs. However, you don't get to control all of the characters at once. You can instantly switch between them and use their unique abilities or even combine them. I mean, this is nothing revolutionary, a bunch of JRPGs and recent gacha games also have similar party mechanics. But still, I believe this is the first isometric action RPG that I played with this feature. Unfortunately, Shadows Awakening doesn't leave very good first impressions, which might be the reason why this game flew under the radar. It takes a while until you get a full party of characters, and the core gameplay mechanics are pretty underwhelming.
But let's talk about the story first.
Jaska, your soul now resides within this demon. It will try to control you, but it is also bound to your will in ways I do not yet understand.
The story was surprisingly interesting, although a little bit all over the place. It can be very confusing, and even the characters don't know what the fuck is going on.
This is very confusing. You get used to it.
The game starts with a mysterious person who summons you from the Shadow Realms. And by you, I mean the demon called Devourer. The hooded man tells you that you have common enemies and that you need to possess one of 3 long-dead heroes. This is where you get to choose your main character, and I first started with the warrior, but when I got the feel of the action combat, I quickly changed my mind. I really didn't like the melee combat in the beginning, so I switched to the range character. I started a new game and I selected the ranger class, which feels a bit better in the beginning. Anyway, this choice is important from the story perspective because each of these 3 heroes have a unique storyline. I found the story interesting overall and a lot better than I expected, especially for a Diablo-like RPG. Although some of the chapters will focus on different party members you picked up along the way, and the game just expects you to keep on with the story. It all happens very fast, which can be pretty confusing. On the bright side, there is a ton of optional dialogue that you can select, which can help you understand what's going on, but still, that's not an excuse. I just think the story could have been presented a bit better, which would make it a lot more enjoyable. The writing ranges from okay to pretty stupid sometimes. The voice acting is inconsistent, it starts out pretty good, but a lot of characters have very mediocre and sometimes bad voice acting. By the way, Troy Baker is one of the main voice actors, and to be honest, I don't think he did an amazing job with this character. Most of the time he sounds like he's delivering his lines through text-to-speech.
Wherever Mara can be found, the cauldron will be also. But she is too powerful. While she possesses the Crucible of Souls, there is no hope of recovering it, I'm afraid. You are not his quarry today. He will not risk pursuing you if it might mean losing me. Head for Temuria, if there's a way to destroy the Crucible of Souls.
The whole story has a more comedic vibe, and it doesn't take itself too seriously, which certainly made the story more enjoyable for me. Now let's talk about the gameplay. Like I said, the gameplay doesn't leave good first impressions. This is another game on the list that has slight input lag, which obviously makes the gameplay less responsive. On top of that, the gameplay itself leaves a lot to be desired. It feels very clunky and floaty, especially for a Diablo-like action RPG. Controlling my character never felt smooth, like in some other similar games. I mean, it's not awful, and you can certainly find a lot worse examples out there, but that doesn't make the game any better. This also depends on which character you play with, because some of them feel better than others. Controlling the demon feels way more responsive because he's a lot faster. But you'll feel the same clunkiness, if that's even a word, when you start using his abilities. Speaking about the demon form, this is one of those unique features. When you switch to the demon, everything around you changes. The environment, the enemies, and puzzle solving is also affected. When you get stuck, it's usually because you'll have to do something in demon form. And like I said, you get to fight different enemy types, although for the most time they feel exactly the same, just with a different skin. You will even see enemies that your normal characters can see, but they remain frozen in time until you switch back. And what I found really cool is that you can use some of your abilities in this form, which will affect all enemies, even the frozen ones. For example, I can quickly switch to the demon and use the freeze spell, and if I switch back to my regular character, the enemy will remain frozen. That's not the only case with the demon. For example, if some of your characters have certain buffs, you can use that spell and it will be active on whatever character you switch. That's definitely one of the coolest features of this game. You can only use 3 spells at once with one character, which felt really underwhelming in the beginning. But when you get a full party of 4, you basically have 12 spells at your disposal. It all depends on how you switch your characters and how well you use your energy resource. It takes a while to get used to, but once you get the hang of it, the gameplay becomes a lot better, compared to the beginning at least. Unfortunately, it takes a while for that to get in motion. I can see why a lot of people would quit the game before they get the full party, which is essentially where the game actually begins. That being said, I think the demon form gets very old very fast. It was very cool in the beginning, but later in the game I almost completely ignored it until I absolutely need to use it. The combat is a bit faster with the demon, but it doesn't feel that good and some enemies are kinda annoying. A lot of bosses in the game take the advantage of the demon form.
meaning that you usually have to break some barrier in the demon form until you get to damage the boss with other characters. I don't have anything bad to say about that. I like when games try to use their unique features as much as possible. Speaking of bosses, they are okay. I only hated a couple of them, like when you have to completely avoid the boss and run in circles like an idiot. The party of 4 characters make the game really flexible in boss fights and the gameplay in general, although sometimes you won't get to control all of them. And that's one of the biggest weak points of the game, because having 4 switchable characters at once is the major thing which makes the gameplay solid, despite all the issues I mentioned about the gameplay before. I made a horrible decision in the beginning by selecting the old school mode, which essentially turns off the quest marks. That's how I usually prefer my RPGs, but if the game is not designed around that philosophy, it only makes the experience a lot worse. The quests have pathetic descriptions of what you need to do, and you can run in circles a lot just because you didn't notice that you can use a lever or something. Don't ask me how I know. This could have been easily avoided if the game had the button to highlight all the interactable objects. You know, like almost every single Diablo-like RPG ever. Putting that aside, I did like the map design. The maps are not huge by any means, but they are not linear either. Combined with the nice visual style of the game and the unique Shadow Realm with the demon, Shadow's Awakening is still a pretty game to look at. Overall, I would recommend trying out this game today. It has enough unique features that you might like if you enjoy playing isometric action RPGs. Just don't expect to have an amazing character progression like in some other Diablo-like RPGs. The itemization is decent, you'll get a bunch of different loot for all characters, but it never felt that important to the game. You'll get to unlock a decent amount of different abilities for all characters, and you have some passive abilities as well. All of that is presented with a very nice UI design. I played this game on hard and it felt pretty balanced. There is a decent amount of challenge, even though some of that challenge comes from the clunky controls and mediocre action in general. Sword Coast Legends is pretty much the only CRPG on this list, and for a very good reason. Unfortunately, it lost its D&D license, so you can't buy it nowadays, but it shouldn't be forgotten because it's a very good CRPG. If Baldur's Gate 3 left you hungry for these kinds of games, I highly recommend checking this game out. Sword Coast Legends is a CRPG set within the universe of Forgotten Realms, a campaign setting of Dungeons & Dragons. This game came out in 2015 and after only a couple of years it got delisted. According to delistedgames.com, Dungeons & Dragons publishing contract has ended, requiring the game to be removed. That's really weird, man. Why would you only buy the license for a couple of years? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Although there is probably a lot more to this story that we don't know, but anyway, I heard about this game back in the day and I always thought it's a pretty bad RPG for some reason. Maybe because of the mediocre ratings and the poor reception, I don't know, but I never wanted to try it out. Well, after playing it for about 5 or 6 hours so far, I can say without a doubt that I was completely wrong. In fact, I'm struggling to find a reason why people didn't like this game that much. Sword Coast Legends is a CRPG, which plays very similar to games like Pillars of Eternity, Baldur's Gate or Pathfinder. However, this game is not extremely deep like those games I mentioned, but that doesn't make it bad. On the contrary, it makes it more accessible to players who want to get into this genre. D&D rules can be very overwhelming for new players, but that's not the case with this game. The only thing that can be a bit overwhelming is the beginning of the game, because you instantly get a lot of party members. All of them have more than a couple of different spells, and it won't take long until the game starts to be a bit more challenging. I played the game on normal and it starts off really easy, but the difficulty picks up after about 40 or 50 minutes in. The character customization should be familiar if you play RPGs and D&D games. You get several different races, classes, and the customization options are pretty good. The game is still looking pretty decent, especially if you can run it on higher resolutions like 4K, and I managed to get a stable 60 FPS for the most part. There are some segments where the game looks really flat or boring, I guess, especially in the open areas, but for the most part, I like how the game looks. It's nothing amazing or anything, but it's more than enough for me to enjoy the game. When it comes to the story, you start the game as a member of the mercenary group called the Burning Dawn. Burning Dawn has a rich history, which is somehow connected to the strange nightmares you and your party members have. The Burning Dawn is hired to escort a caravan from Neverwinter to the city of Luskan, and this is where the game begins. You start clearing the area of bandits, and the main story of the game quickly picks up. It doesn't take long for some significant things to happen, which I found quite interesting, mainly because most of the characters are decently written and voice acted.
I assume you're with that halfling that came through here. I have never seen such anger. Not since I raised Kipper Harple's old cat from the dead.
There are a bunch of dialogue interactions with RPG skill checks and actual gameplay consequences. So yeah, pretty much everything you will want to see in a game like this is there.
You have come. Enough, I'm not here for sex.
The gameplay mechanics are also fun to play around with, and you will have to do some micromanagement in fights, even on the normal difficulty. The party AI is pretty good, so the characters you're not directly controlling at the moment will cast appropriate spells for the most part. But if you like these kinds of games, I'm pretty sure you will want to make those kinds of decisions yourself. This is a real-time combat RPG with pause menu, which you'll use a lot. It's very easy to tell the characters what to do, and controlling them is fairly responsive. They won't always instantly do what you want, but it's not a huge deal. The animations are decent at best, but it's serviceable for this kind of a game. There is a very simple gore effect in combat, which can turn some enemies into chunks of meat upon death, which looks a bit stupid, but I can appreciate that. However, compared to how the combat looks in similar modern CRPGs, this game is pretty basic. And I guess that's one of the reasons why the game got such poor receptions, along with the fact that it's not very deep, like I said before. I mean, not extremely deep for D&D standards. The speed of the combat is okay, but I would like to have an option to speed up or slow down the gameplay like in most modern CRPGs. The only notable problem that I had with the gameplay so far is the poor quest design in some cases. Some of the quests can feel like the game is trying to artificially extend the playtime. For example, before you enter the city of Luskan, you will need to explore the sewer system and do some quests there. The level design is okay, but some of the quests make you run back and forth for seemingly no reason. On the other side, it seems like the quests can be done in multiple ways if you know where to look or what to look for. The dialogue itself is well written, and the main story is interesting enough to keep you progressing through the game. And the actual progression system is decent. It pretty much encourages you to invest points into multiple skill trees. So it's not like the game doesn't have any depth, it's just not as deep as some modern CRPGs. My main character was a two-handed warrior, because of course he was. Your party members are very balanced from the very beginning, but you will meet other characters as you play, and you can manage your party members in the camp. So it seems like you can definitely have some nice flexibility with the party management. I still didn't finish the game, but I enjoyed it quite a bit so far. If you could actually get this game today, I would definitely recommend it, especially if you like CRPGs with some light D&D rules. But you know, you can actually get the game if you try hard enough. Or should I say, hard enough, matey. And at number 1 we have a blast from the past. Blade of Darkness was an amazing action adventure with a brutal action combat. It's number 1 on my list for a reason, because I spent a lot of time thinking about this game even after I was done, and I can't wait to do another playthrough in the near future. Here's what I had to say about my number 1 obscure action adventure. Blade of Darkness is an action adventure that originally came out in 2001. In 2021, we got a remastered version on Steam, and that's the version that I've been playing. I wanted to cover this game ever since it got a remastered version, I just never got around to. There is a lot to love about Blade of Darkness, even though it's obviously very outdated. The visuals are very primitive for today's standards, of course, but that doesn't bother me personally. It actually grew on me the more I played, and despite the outdated graphics, the game still manages to create an amazing atmosphere. An amazing dark atmosphere that really puts you in a certain mood. I mean, it's right there in the title. When you start the game, you get to choose between 4 different characters. They all have different weapon specialities, strengths and weaknesses. They also start the game on different maps, but eventually all of them go through the same routes. I only played the game with Turrican because he prefers two-handed weapons, just like myself. Although I could use a bow with him, and the majority of weapons I found during my playthrough. This game is all about the gameplay, even though there are some cutscenes when you get to a new location, as well as at the end of the level. To be completely honest, I don't remember anything about the story, even though I did like the vibe of the cutscenes. 4 creatures are awakening from the dormancy and spreading terror and destruction. The darkness has returned, and the end is near. That's the main gist of the story, according to Wikipedia.
It doesn't matter a lot because this game is all about the gameplay. Some people will say that this game is the granddad of Souls-like games, although I would disagree. Blade of Darkness can definitely be very challenging, and there are some similarities with Souls-like games, like the energy/stamina system. However, the gameplay in this game leans towards hack and slash style. At first the combat feels very odd and not so precise because of the controls and stiff animations. But if you give it a proper chance, it's not so hard to get used to. At least that was the case with my playthrough. The combat is all about different combos and unique weapon abilities. There is a decent amount of different weapons to pick up and all of them have something unique. You have a menu with all the combos and learning how to use them in combat is very satisfying. Although once I found something I really like, I rarely switch my tactic in combats. For example, I love this sidestep with a slash and I used it a lot. I found a lot of unique two-handed swords and I was always very curious about their special abilities. In order to perform these special abilities, the game requires you to be a certain level and they usually cost a lot of energy. You will have to manage your energy resource, but it's not that aggressive like in Souls-like games, it's a lot more forgiving. If you don't spam your special ability, you won't even know it's there. The game requires you to be somewhat precise with your positioning in combat. You can't really take a ton of hits and survive. But this also depends on your defense stats. There are some armor pieces that you will find throughout your campaign, which will boost your defense stat, but this is very rare. It's not like the weapons, which can be found on each enemy and various locations. It's really enjoyable trying to learn the combos on weapons, if not a little bit clumsy. Although a lot of these combos don't seem to be worth it, especially when the combat gets really intense. When you're fighting multiple enemies at once, which will happen quite often, you don't have the time to execute a complicated combo. Maybe if you're really good at this game, but I usually stick with just a couple of simple attacks. I'm not saying that these complicated combos are not worth doing at all. If you manage to pull them off without getting attacked or killed, you'll do a ton of damage. And I always try to memorize the unique ability of each weapon I used. But like I said, most regular enemies can just be killed with simple attacks. We should really talk about the gore, which makes the combat very enjoyable. If you didn't notice already, you can cut enemies in various ways. You get the same treatment if you get killed, by the way, it's very brutal. Cutting enemies in half never gets boring in this game. I think I'm saying that a lot for all games that have dismemberment features. But still, the gore effects are very enjoyable in Blade of Darkness and it's one of the staples of this combat system. All weapons have durability as well, which means they can break. It takes a while for that to happen, so I didn't find it very annoying. There is something very addictive about the gameplay in these older games, and I can't quite put my finger on it. The level design might be one of those things. I absolutely love the old school level design, and the maps you're going to explore are pretty big and vertical. All of these maps have a lot of verticality in terms of multiple floors and different areas to explore. You'll usually need to find keys for certain doors, which makes you explore the whole map, but it never feels tedious. Sometimes the game will dial this up and you'll need to find multiple items on the map to open a door, or lift in this particular case. The game tells you very little about what you need to do, so you can get stuck sometimes. That can certainly get annoying, but the map design is very well done, which makes it more bearable. If you remember, when we talked about Shadows Awakening, I mentioned how the maps are obviously not designed around the old school modes. However, in this game, you can clearly tell it's designed around this philosophy. Even though you don't know what exactly you need to do, or where you need to go, you'll figure it out by just exploring the map. It never got boring, and I rarely went in circles around the map before I stumbled upon the item I need to progress further. The only thing I didn't like that much is how the game respawns some enemies. For example, I would clean this area of enemies completely, and when I came back after a while, after exploring the other side of the map, the enemies would respawn. I mean, it's not a huge deal, but it feels very cheap. The boss fights are kinda weak in this game because they're usually not that interesting to fight. They just have a ton of health and they fight like a buffed up version of regular enemies. Some of them are unique, but fighting them never felt that good. It's just a bunch of moving out of the way and trying to land a hit on them. Wait a minute, that sounds a lot like modern Souls-like games, does it? I didn't hate the boss fights though, I just think they're not the best part about this game. Overall, I love this game and I can't wait to replay it with some other character. And that will be it for my top 10 RPGs and action adventures. I hope you enjoyed this video and tell me about your top 10 RPGs and action adventures in the comments below. Tell me your opinion about the games that I covered in the video as well. Do you agree or disagree? Let me know. Be sure to subscribe if you enjoyed the video. You can also support me by becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon. I also have some cool t-shirts and hoodies in the theme of the channel, so check that out as well. Huge thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.